together a larger group. The benefit of that is that we're in a situation where, for questions like this environment and conflict question, where insights from more than one discipline are actually important. For the issue of conflict, and for a lot of issues dealing with fundamental questions of human well-being and how we interact with each other, the question becomes more important than the discipline that you are situated in when you ask that. You know, we should be focused on solving or understanding a certain problem. And that means trying to get ourselves out of the silo that we're in intellectually and saying, what are the tools that are needed to solve this problem? And so I think the benefit that comes from working with the Climate Impact Lab, the reason why it's somewhat organically evolved into the thing that it is, with, as you said, computer scientists and economists and climate scientists and others, is that it allows us to stay focused on a problem and bring together the resources we need. And sometimes it's true, we do need, if we want to understand, for example, uncertainty in what the future is going to be like, we need real climate science there to tell us. But we also need the economists to say, well, here's what we understand about the link to the economy. Here's what we understand about this aspect of the economic system. And currently the climate science is not seeing this part, and the economics is not seeing what the climate science can do. So we actually need to find some bridge in between these. And it's allowed us in doing that to solve questions in a way which we think is more focused on the actual policy actions you could take. So to do this in a way which is really hyper local, we can get this information all over the world, right down to the equivalent of the county level in different countries. We can do a full quantification of uncertainty, which I think is useful for if you're thinking of investments, or if you're thinking of just generally thinking of your climate risks broadly. It helps to know what your average change might be in the future, but it also helps to know what your 1 in 20 or 1 in 10, your risk of change might be. So what the full distribution is. And I think that's what this collaboration has allowed us to do.
So as a follow-up to that, I feel like oftentimes in the world of academia, which of course you have much more experience in than we do, it's easy to get caught up in looking at really highly consequential and urgent issues like climate change, public health, poverty as intellectual exercises or things that are intellectually interesting rather than as serious issues that affect people's well-being and livelihood. So given your role in the Climate Impact Lab, or just in general, how do we make sure that we're not just researching for researching and actually taking into account the human factor with these issues?
This is absolutely something that I wrestle with on an, if not daily basis, then an almost daily basis. And I think I spent a lot of time early on in my career in my research career doing long stints of field work. Sometimes particularly in development economics, that can be the interactions there with the place that you're studying can actually be quite short, but I would try and go for as long as possible and spend a few months in a place and try to learn as much as possible about the people who were being affected by the thing I was trying to research. And partly that did two things. One was to make sure that I understood well. And I think a lot of the really good development economists that I look up to do have this really, even if they don't write about it in their papers, sometimes they do have this really in-depth knowledge of the places that they're working in. And they have people who they work with there who are living there full-time from those locations that are able to provide context when needed. The other thing that it helps to do is when I sit down and see some data point or some data set on a different outcome, it helps me try and connect that. It's something that I have to consciously do, but helps me try and connect it back to some of the stories that I remember from sitting in a focus group in a small village in Bangladesh or somewhere, and try to remember that there's enormous consequences to getting these answers right and this information. So that's the one aspect of this. I think the other part is recognizing that there's kind of an ecosystem around this. So I'm a researcher because I derive some kind of enjoyment from finding out new things. And I think that's true of most academics. There's some reward to just thinking deeply and understanding something. And that might be what motivates us to some extent. I think most of the people, particularly at a policy school, are also motivated by solving a real problem. One of the things which we've tried to do with Climate Impact Lab, and just that I think some of us try to do generally, is to make sure that we recognize there's a broader ecosystem around that knowledge system. There's people who will be able to use it. There's people who might rely on that information. There's people whose lives will be improved by finding out answers to different questions. And to make sure that we don't just sit in our offices on our computers writing the papers, but actually get nudged towards what the important question is.
Speaking of visiting developing countries, I saw that you've been to Kenya. I saw some photos on your website.
Yes, my father was from Tanzania, actually. And
okay. I'm from Kenya.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the thing which I didn't realize was for years was my father grew up in Tanzania, and they had actually moved to Kenya originally from India in the 1800s. But my last name means name in Swahili.
Yeah.
And so when I landed in Kenya for the first time on my immigration form, I wrote down, it said Jina, and then I wrote Jina after it. And the immigration officials found this so funny. One guy cracked up and he called over the guy next to him, and like a little crowd were like, this guy doesn't know what he's doing. I was like, no, that's really my name. They looked at my passport and everything. But yeah, so I have a connection to there. The work in Kenya was actually part of working with the United Nations, with UNICEF and the United Nations Environment Program, in trying to help be part. There was this small network of people at African universities trying to think about climate adaptation, and particularly this youth initiative that was starting. So part of it was them trying to support this, and a few people went there and kind of helped with the knowledge sharing that was related to that. So I think it's another one of those things actually that, even though I don't have research from there at that time, the connections that I made and some of the things I got to experience in different community conservation projects, for example, have actually stuck with me a lot. And those are some of the things which provide the motivation, or at least some context for why I continue to try and sit behind my computer and sometimes boring work of doing the papers.
So you earlier said that, although, we know that there's an effect of shocks to water supply and conflict behavior, that we don't know much about the mechanisms. Specifically, I think during the panel you said that shocks to water systems are increasing the risk of conflict by about 5 to 10%. First of all, can you just explain in simple terms, what do those numbers mean? What does that mean?
That was coming from a paper of a co-author of mine who had done this broad meta-analysis of about 60 different research projects at all different scales, looking at what the climate conflict link was, standardizing those, making sure they controlled for all the unobservable differences that might lead to problems in that interpretation, so that you could interpret those causally, and then looked at the average effect of those. And what they found was this kind of one standard deviation change in precipitation. So not really in the lake access or something like that, but just in a precipitation shock led to this 5% difference. So that was a very specific thing. It's hard. So I'm fairly confident that we can interpret those things causally because of the way we set up it's observational data, but we set up kind of the experiment with our panel data and our fixed effects and all the things that become important for dealing with, for turning this interpretation into a causal one rather than just correlational. I think what we would need to understand exactly what those mechanisms are is, in some cases, just a lot more data, a lot more research, but also in particular, a lot more a lot more understanding of the effect of certain policies, either directly related to conflict or not. So there's this fascinating paper about the monsoon in India and looking at crime rates due to changes in the amount of rainfall that happened in the monsoon in India. And it found that there was a relationship between less rain and more crime. And then it looked at the rollout of this Rural Employment Guarantee Act, which was an act in the mid-2000s, which gave guaranteed labor for people, or days of work for people who were unemployed, or if there was, so for example, if there's an agricultural shock, their crop failed, they could go and get access to work for pay. And so it was this Work Guarantee Act. The way that was rolled out across the country wasn't exactly random, but it was turned on in some states at certain times differently. And what this research paper is by a guy named Timo Fetzer, this research paper found was that the relationship between rainfall and conflict almost completely disappeared. And that tells us a lot about what might be happening behind this mechanism. This is something saying, well, if we know that this is related to employment, what's the main source of employment that's being targeted by this policy? It's agricultural employment, to make sure that people don't end up unemployed or losing money that comes from either being a landless laborer who's employed on a farm or having your own crops fail if you own your own land. That allows us to say, well, we've identified a little bit more what the source of that link could be. It's down to the food supply, but more than just the food supply, it's down to people's ability to make money. You know, the amount that people were getting for this extra day of work wasn't actually that much money. So it shows potentially how desperate people had gotten that they would, you know, engage in this really risky crime conflict behavior in order to make up for that loss. And it tells us quite a lot about the actual household budgeting decision that goes into what might make somebody engage in a pretty desperate activity. And so I think it's situations like that where we can understand the role that certain policies play, where we know the policy targets a certain specific mechanism, where we start to learn a lot more. But that's a slow process of building up information. The ideal would be that we could then see this, learn something from it, and say, okay, maybe a way to deal with conflict, the environmental conflict nexus, is instead of focusing on ending the conflict once it happens, why don't we think of something like a social safety net as being a conflict reduction policy?
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for your time, and also for the important work you're doing. It's very interesting and, of course, important. So.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Root of Conflict, featuring Amir Jina. This episode was produced and edited by Ashwarya Raje and Mwangi Thuita. Thank you to UC3P and the Pearson Institute for their continued support for this series. For more information on the Pearson Institute's events and research, visit thepearsoninstitute.org and follow them on Twitter.